All right, today I have the honor of introducing our speaker, Dr. Ann Johnson. I thought I just deleted my note there for a second. Ann Johnson is known for her unique suet recipe that is used, we believe, nowhere else in the entire United States. I'm sure you'll probably hear about that today. She just finished up her PhD at Penn State about predators of the spotted lanternfly. She was with the lab of Kelly Hoover, Kelly Hoover's lab. She did her undergrad in entomology at Michigan State University, and she's an expert crafter who plays the French horn in the State College Municipal Band. And I just learned that State College has a municipal band. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Ann Johnson.
So, hi everyone, I am Ann. As stated, just finished up my PhD here, working on general predators of spotted lanternfly. But today, for the bird club, I figured what I would focus on are birds as predators. I can get this started. Nope. Let's try that again. There it goes. Okay, so. Has anyone heard of spotted lanternfly before? I'm hoping so. Okay, yes, good. So spotted lanternfly is an invasive plant hopper. We don't have too many big plant hoppers here in the US. So most people, sometimes I hear people call it a moth. It's actually more closely related to like a cicada. They were first found in the US back in 2014 in Berks County, Pennsylvania. Since that time, they have spread to an additional like 17 states, which is quite remarkable. And one of the things that maybe is helping them spread a little bit is that they can actually feed on a whole bunch of different plants. They feed on a whole bunch of woody plants, especially as adults, but when they're in their younger stages, they are also feeding on a lot of herbaceous plants. Here in Pennsylvania, one of our big concerns is that they really like to feed on grape. So, for example, one of our Penn State Extension people, Claudia Schmidt, went and did a survey of local vineyard owners. There was one vineyard that in their 20-year-old vines, they were experiencing a net loss per acre of $8,600 annually, just from increased treatment costs. And then in their 6-year-old vines, which were newer and therefore more susceptible to the stresses that the lanternflies were putting on them, they actually had vine loss, which meant that they had a net loss per acre of more than $30,000 just because they also had to replace those vines. So it is quite a big issue in vineyards here, especially since Pennsylvania is one of our more important grape growing states. One of the things that is pretty cool about spotted lanternfly, at least to me, is that we think it's capable of something called toxin sequestration, which is where an organism takes up potentially harmful compounds from its environment and basically stores them for its own use. A lot of animals do this. Monarch butterflies are the ones that people often think of, where they're taking up toxins from milkweed and storing them to defend themselves against predators. And that is what we think that spotted lanternfly is also using their stored compounds for primarily. It's just to make themselves taste kind of bad to anything that wants to eat them. One of the things that led us to start thinking about this conclusion is these bright contrasting colors that spotted lanternfly have, where they have that bright red with the black patterning. And you'll see that a lot in defended animals. Think of your wasps, where they're bright yellow with the black bands, or monarchs, where they're bright orange with the black. It's basically a way for the predators to see, and then if you get stung or sick after eating one once, you'll remember next time you see something that's bright colored with black patterning, oh, I probably don't want to mess with that. So that's kind of how that defense against predators works. The plant that we think that spotted lanternfly, or I guess at this point, now that I've finished my work, that we know spotted lanternfly is sequestering these toxins from, is one of its preferred hosts, which is called Tree of Heaven. So tree of heaven is another invasive. It's actually from Southeast Asia, which is the same place that spotted lanternflies are from, but it's been in the US for far longer. It actually was first introduced back in the 1700s as an ornamental plant. And it is really good at spreading. So now it's pretty much everywhere across the US and into Canada. Before my work started, we knew that it did contain toxins that they've also had found in spotted lanternfly, notably ones called wasanoids, which are the ones that I ended up looking at and confirming that they were taking in from tree of heaven. And then indole alkaloids, which actually one of my friends is attempting to confirm. So we also, now that they're in a new area, did somewhat want to look at if there were any toxic plants here in the US that could maybe affect things. The one I specifically looked at was black walnut, because they do tend to start preferring to feed on black walnut around the same time in their life cycle that they prefer to feed on tree of heaven. So wait for later in the talk to find out what I found out there. So what did we know about our predator-prey interactions in spotted lanternfly before all of this? Not actually all that much. They were actually invasive in Korea and Japan before they reached here in the US. So there was some work done by Penn et al. Back in 2011, where they found that wild magpies would vomit after feeding on spotted lanternfly they just collected from the field. And there was a study by Song et al. In 2018, where they basically mixed up spotted lanternfly bits into butterballs, some that they had collected off of Korean willow, some that they had collected off of the tree of heaven, and they did find that the birds were much more likely to feed on the ones that had been collected off of the willow. In the US, we had even less information, but we were getting reports from veterinarians of people bringing in their pets that had fed on spotted lanternfly with things like drooling and nausea and loss of appetite after they had fed on. So, we also had some limited evidence for what predators were present and were having these interactions. A lot of it was on arthropods. We had a report come in 2016 of a wheel bug, which is like this fancy little bug. You can actually see them around now because it's their mating season. So they're about an inch-ish long, and then they're called wheel bugs because they have a little gear-like structure on their back. It can also give humans a pretty good nip as well. So don't enclose them in your hand, but as long as you're gentle and just let them go where they like, usually you're okay. If you need to say, move them out of the street or something. And we also had a predatory stink bug reported feeding on our spotted lanternflies. The evidence of other predators, especially birds, was anecdotal. A lot of people were like, yep, my chickens eat them. But we didn't have like a good systematic review of everything that was eating them, which is what I decided to start out my project doing. So back in 2020, I created a Facebook page called Birds Fighting Bad Bugs, which was shared widely by several different organizations, bird watching groups. It might have even been, I don't know, it might have gotten past to you guys, Penn State Extension for sure, local media outlets, master gardener groups. So lots of people contributed, and I was very grateful because it resulted in us getting nearly 1,300 unique reports by the time that I ended this project, 526 of which included pictures or videos of the interactions. So from this, we were able to do a breakdown of what sort of predators we were seeing feeding on spotted lanternfly. Most of them were arthropod predators. This is my little wheel bug. Here we go. I knew there was one in here somewhere. Followed by bird predators, which Bardal I thought was really cool. You can see the lanternfly. And then in the distant third were our mammalian predators. That's a little chipmunk. When looking at the breakdown of the arthropod groups, I broke them down by order. And the most commonly reported order was Araneae, which are the spiders. So we had lots and lots of spiders, catching them both in the webs, or some of our more ambush predatory spiders like wolf spiders and jumping spiders will also eat up these guys. Coming in second was the praying mantis order. Mantidea. So a lot of these were Chinese brand mantises, but also some of our native species. This is a Carolina mantis, which is feeding on a spotted lanternfly. So mantises were also doing quite a good job of taking these down. And then coming in third for our most common order was Hymenoptera, which is bees, ants, and wasps. So most bees are not really predatory, not so much bees in this case, but lots of ants and wasps were still feeding on lanternflies. Then on the bird side, our most common family was Phasianidae, which is the chicken family, and a lot of them were chickens, as well as domesticated turkeys and actually some peafowl as well. I will say this is probably an observer bias. People are around chickens a lot. You have a good opportunity to notice what they're feeding on. I don't really think chickens are like a fantastic, spotted lanternfly munching machine or anything like that. I think people just have a better opportunity to actually see this interaction. For our wild birds, the cardinal family was actually the one that was most common. Most of these were northern cardinals, but we also had scarlet tanagers and rose-breasted grosbeaks. I hope I said that right. That would be embarrassing if I didn't. And then coming in third was Nereidae, which is our catbird family, and these were primarily catbirds that were feeding on them. Other notable mentions were corvids actually fed on them a lot, especially blue jays and crows. So now that, in addition to basically what was feeding them on them, we did get some additional information from our people who made reports. We gave them this guide to identify the spotted lanternfly. So some people included information on what life stage they had seen being preyed on, as well as what host plant they were on, and basically the feeding behaviors of the predators. So we decided to sort of compare these different things to see how they affected our interactions. So starting out with just generally our type of predator, the ones who had feeding behaviors actually recorded, often for our birds, which is why that bar is so much larger. They were experiencing illness less frequently than expected, which just means that compared to these other groups, the number of times, for example, that mammals were experiencing illness probably meant that our overall group were expecting a certain amount of illness, and the birds were not getting sick as often. So this is actually a decent indication that they're at least able to tolerate feeding on spotted lanternfly, or maybe developing strategies to avoid some of the areas that may be containing more of these defenses, which we think arthropods may be doing as well. Notably, these areas are the wings, which were removed more frequently than expected. Monarch butterflies, for example, do sequester a lot of their defenses of the wings. And when I did some work sort of categorizing around the body, that exoskeleton is an area that has these possumioids in it. So if you get rid of your wings, you are removing some of them from your diet, making them a bit easier to eat. Mammals, we're doing the opposite of birds. Mammals don't seem to really like the well-defended spotted lanternflies. They were getting sick after feeding on them more than we would have thought. And they were eating them whole less frequently, which means they were often like spitting them out, or, just generally not really doing a great job, not having a great time trying to feed on these guys. Amphibians died more than expected. I will say this is actually only one frog that ended up dying, and it's hard to determine if it was because of the spotted lanternfly. So what this specific report was that this person had seen this frog in their pond feeding on spotted lanternfly throughout the season. And then at the end of the season, they found the frog dead with no marks on it. So they assumed it was poisoned over time by just constantly feeding on the lanternflies. The problem is that it could have been old age, it could have been, someone's pesticides got into the water. So it's not necessarily because of lanternflies, but there was a froggy who unfortunately did not make it. Then looking at across our spotted lanternfly life cycle, most of our reports were of adults. This is because adults are large and showy, so people see them. But we did still get some information on the earlier stages. For example, our early nymphs, which are the little black ones, were eaten whole more frequently than expected. And they had their wings removed less frequently than expected. It is important to note, though, that our nymphs don't actually have wings yet. So that's probably just, you know, an effect of the way the math works. Our late nymphs were also eaten whole more frequently than expected. So our nymphs are probably less well defended than the adults, which is borne out by things I did later where I quantified the amount of toxins in them. Our adults were eaten whole less frequently than expected, and were having their wings removed more frequently than expected. So again, maybe some strategies among our birds and other predators to sort of limit the amount of toxins they're taking. When looking at our feeding behaviors by the known host plants, the ones that were on our tree of heaven were getting avoided more frequently than expected. They were being eaten whole less frequently than expected. This is kind of what we would, you know, expect to see if this is the host plant that they're taking the toxins from. So it's good that our tree of heaven one, basically they're not eating them whole off of that. For our host plants that were other things than maples, walnuts, or tree of heaven, these were eaten whole more frequently than expected. Again, that sort of reinforces the idea that if they're feeding on things that aren't tree of heaven, they're maybe not taking these defenses and not as able to defend themselves against birds and such. And while there was no significant, statistically significant results with our walnut, I would just like to point out that only 2 of the things that were on walnut were not actually like eaten whole. So this is actually a good indication that walnut is not a source of those defenses. They're not sequestering any toxins from walnut, which we were kind of worried about. So thankfully, our native trees that potentially could have provided them toxins don't seem to be, or at least not anything that's deterring predation. So for our conclusions, a lot of our generalist arthropods and birds are feeding on spotted lanternfly. Predator type, life stage, and the host plant all play roles in these predator interactions, with a good indication that they are sequestering things from tree of heaven, and that this level of sequestration varies across the life cycle. So you can also check out my paper. This is open access, which means anyone can see it if you want a more in-depth breakdown of this. So from that work, it then led me to want to take a bit more of a closer look at exactly how tree of heaven was affecting these interactions, just because while we got the host plant that they were observed feeding on, we don't know what they fed on throughout their whole life. So what I decided to do was to actually rear out a whole bunch of spotted lanternflies that had either had access to that tree of heaven or had not. And then for our nymphal spotted lanternfly stages, what we did is we put them into these little, we put them into these little feeding cups on top of some nest boxes out around Penn State's campus and the Arboretum at the student farm, along with some live mealworms, which would just attract these house wrens' attention to those feeding cups. They would be happy to feed on the dead frozen spotted lanternfly after, but they did need that initial movement to draw their attention. And then we did this with all the nymphal stages and observed to see what the birds did with that spotted lanternfly. Were they eating it themselves? Were they feeding it to their chicks? Were they just like tossing it aside, going, ew? And then after 24 hours, we went back to see how many spotted lanternfly were missing. So what we found for all of our nymphal stages is that a larger proportion of the ones that had never had access to tree of heaven were being eaten or fed to the chicks, which is again a really good indication that those defenses are coming from tree of heaven. One of the things that you may notice is that I said we observed what the birds did with them. So we were able to bring in, this is Gabby Davis. She was an undergrad McNair scholar, which means that the McNair program is just one to sort of encourage people from underrepresented groups to go into grad school. So we did a little bit more where we actually tracked based on whether those lanternflies have been reared with access to tree of heaven or not, whether they have been dropped, fed to the chicks, or eaten by the adults themselves. What we found was that while there wasn't like any significant differences, the birds were only willing to feed the ones that had never had access to Tree of Heaven to their chicks. They were willing to eat some of the Atlantis ones themselves, but they would not feed them to the chicks. So this shows perhaps a certain sensitivity on the parent side where they're maybe using the less desirable prey for themselves and then going to feed the chicks things that they were catching or are mealworms, which were fine, they were just mealworms. So that was pretty. Then we needed to do our suet work.
To clarify, when you were feeding bird boxes, you weren't, otherwise a box would get all of one type and another box would get all of another type. So it wasn't that you didn't trick them.
Yeah.
Like once they,
No, because at least with these guys, it seemed like they needed to eat a few and establish that, oh yeah, no, this does taste icky before they would stop eating the rest, which is why like well, you can see it from here too, but you know, they were eating some of them. They weren't just like, they didn't seem to be able to like smell it or anything. They were just, they would try a few, be like, oh no, I don't like this, and then they would move on. So that actually plays well into this as well. Our adult spotted lanternflies don't come out till after the birds are done nesting, the house wrens at least. So what we did instead for these guys is that we actually incorporated our adult spotted lanternfly that had been reared with access to Tree of Heaven, either into a batch of suet that was with Tree of Heaven or a batch of suet that was without. We put up these feeders that we observed in trail cameras at Shavers Creek, thank you very much. Millbrook Marsh, thank you very much. And around the Penn State Arboretum. So we used trail cameras to capture the videos, and then we went back through and we had, I think it was 256 hours of video to go through. Where we counted the number of times that each bird pecked each type of suet. And what we found is that they did indeed significantly peck the suet that was containing spotted lanternfly reared without access to Tree of Heaven more. It's really hard to see that on this graphic specifically because you'll notice these little observations of around hundreds of pecks. Those were woodpeckers. Woodpeckers were consistently pecking like 60 to 100 times, whereas a lot of our songbirds were like 6 times that they were pecking on the suet. So we did go through and actually separate these out. So these were the 5 most common, I'm going to say, I called them small bird, but non-woodpecker species that visited our suet. We did always have them pecking our non-Tree of Heaven suet more, but it was only a significant difference in our white-breasted nuthatches and our chickadees. For our woodpeckers, we had downies, harries, and red bellies visiting. Again, always pecking the suet that was made without, with the lanternflies that did not feed on Tree of Heaven more, but significantly so for our red bellied and our downy woodpeckers. So even as adults, which again, we would be expecting from our citizen science results, it does seem to be that they are sequestering defenses from the Tree of Heaven. So what did we learn from these experiments? We learned that birds are affected by these sequestered defenses throughout the spotted lanternfly life cycle, which again, we maybe didn't know from our citizen science just because we were seeing things eaten whole. What may be contributing to that is that we basically forced our nymphs to feed on Tree of Heaven, whereas in the wild, they actually don't necessarily prefer that as the nymphs. They find it a bit hard to feed on. They can only really feed on the leaves. They can't pierce the bark yet. So they wouldn't necessarily be feeding on that Tree of Heaven until that last red nymphal stage in the adults in the wild anyways. Though I will say, I did find through my chemical analyses that some of those defenses do seem to be passed down from the parents. So like your eggs and your Kirsten stars may get some residual benefits from the parents feeding on Tree of Heaven. But when they were feeding on Tree of Heaven, they were able to sequester and defend off at least our bird predators throughout the life cycle. And potentially our nesting birds are more picky about spotted lanternfly defenses because again, they weren't willing to feed them to their chicks, even if they were willing to eat them themselves. So what does this all mean? It means great news, at least here in North America, we do have some generalist predators that will eat on spotted lanternfly, especially our arthropods and our birds. And it means that our predator-prey interactions can be affected by these defenses that spotted lanternfly are sequestering from tree of heaven. So if we remove tree of heaven from our yards, we might see more predation by the birds. So what all can we do? You want to attract birds to your yard to help feed on your spotted lanternfly. You're going to want to avoid using outwards facing sticky bands as a trap for your spotted lanternfly, unless you're putting like a really fine mesh over them, just because unfortunately a lot of our birds can get stuck in those outward facing sticky bands. Instead, you can use inward facing sticky bands, which is where you take like, it's a lot like quilting batting, but it's like in a thin strip and then you wrap it around and then the sticky side actually faces in towards the trunk. And that prevents the bird sticking on them. As far as I know, no one's ever reported a bird getting caught on an inward facing sticky band. Because the sticky is again facing the bark, so the bugs can like go up and then they get caught on the sticky because they can actually fit under there, but the birds shouldn't be able to. Or more recently, we had circle traps come out, which are just a different type of trap. They kind of look like a mesh funnel, and then they funnel them up into like a bag or a bottle. And there are instructions on how to make these yourself on Penn State's website, or they're available for sale if you don't feel like making your own. We can also attract birds by providing them with food. Please use clean feeders. I feel like you guys know better than I. A dirty feeder is a great way to spread disease, so please clean your feeders. Plant fruit-bearing plants and reduce insecticide use, especially around times that birds are nesting, because it can impact their reproductive ability. Provide them with water, a bird bath. I recommend running and circulating water just because as an entomologist, I'm very aware of the mosquito risk in standing water. So if you have a little bit of circulation, you prevent a lot of that. And providing them with shelter, so cover, nesting sites, a variety of plants, long grasses, wood piles, basically encouraging the birds to, you know, have a place to stay. Because everyone just basically wants food, water, and shelter, if you want them when you're going. And the good news is that if you do these things, you might also start attracting your arthropod predators, especially avoiding using insecticides. That's going to up your arthropod predator populations really quick. And providing a variety of plants also tends to increase your arthropod population. So these are all great things you can do to get these predators into your yard and maybe help with your lanternfly populations, especially if you remove that tree of heaven. So if you have any questions, these are my assorted contact methods. That's my Penn State email. It's the one, I'm going to be honest, I'm terrible at answering emails, but I'm okay at answering Facebook Messenger posts. So that's not the best way to reach me, to be honest. But I do have these two emails as well. So if you have any questions, contact me there, or I think we have time.
We definitely have time for questions with
Contact
you.
me here. Yep.
Yeah, so if people have questions, feel free to ask, and maybe if you could like reiterate so that people on Zoom could kind of get a sense of what the question was while you answer. And for people on Zoom, I'll be monitoring the chat if you have questions, and I can field those as well.
Yes.
What's the best way to eradicate the tree of heaven?
Unfortunately, tree of heaven can regrow basically from the root. So you're going to need to try and get that whole root out, or what you can do is you basically cut down to stump and then you soak that stump in herbicide. But you do need to either get that root out or kill it something, because they will just regrow from the base.
There's another method called slash and squirt. I
Yes.
think you cut into the tree and treat
Yeah.
it without cutting.
Yep.
And that might.
It might work. I will note that then you do have, if this is on your property and it's near your house, you do then have a dead tree that's right by your house and is not necessarily going to stay up on its own. But if you have like tons of acreage and it's not near anything you care about, I think that's a great thing. Yeah.
the beginning, you showed some data about whether the predators remove the wings.
Yeah,
So do they remove the wings because they eat the wings, or remove the wings because they don't like them and they want to eat them?
they remove the wings and they drop them off to the side and then they eat the body. So, yeah.
So I read that in southeastern PA where the parent is first. Not put into.
Yeah. Yes, I'm also realizing I just have not been repeating these questions. So the question was, that, people are saying in Southeast PA where they were first introduced that the populations are lower. Is this true? Yes, it is true. But I will note in some of the most earliest invaded places, they are rising again. So what we think is going on is that the spotted lanternflies are setting up what is called a boom bust cycle. This is fairly common in ecology, where basically they use up the resources in the area, their populations decline, and then once those resources recover, it seems it takes about 3 years, their populations will start to rise again. Here, they have unused resources right to the side, so they're probably at least expanding out right now instead of necessarily reinvesting. But over time, it's likely that we'll start seeing this sort of cyclical pattern in their populations. Yeah.
Are there habitats that are more resilient to invasion? So if a forest land has a healthy population of native birds, will it be more resilient to
Yeah,
heat symptoms?
so you're basically a diverse habitat is going to be more resilient to invasions by many different invasive insects. So if you have a lot of different kinds of plants, you have which brings in a lot of different kind of like arthropods. So both not only are predatory arthropods, but also like arthropods that would say compete with a new incoming species that's not established there yet. So like, you know, if my spotted lanternfly want to be feeding on maples, but the maples are already like keyed to defend themselves because they've been defending against like, I don't know, rosy maple moth or something, then already those lanternflies are at a disadvantage for entering into that area. So basically a very diverse, like, you know, I guess healthy habitat where it's a lot of different species, especially native species, is going to be more resilient to invasion. Yeah. Yeah.
Full conservation of the animals.
Yeah.
What kind of species that you?
So there's one really cool species that we had reported eating the spotted lanternfly eggs. And this is a little creature called a trash bug. And what trash bugs are that they're actually the larvae of a thing called a lacewing, which you might be more familiar with, especially if you do a lot of gardening, because they'll sell lacewings for like aphid control. And they will eat aphids as both the larvae and the adults. But these little trash bugs are basically the babies of a specific species of this lacewing, and they'll like actually pull up the wax and use to like put on their back and eat the egg as they go. I think the other ones we had were slugs, ladybugs. There aren't as many things feeding on the eggs, but there were like a few of our invertebrates were seemingly willing to do it. Yeah, so yeah.
A number of our area hawk watchers, Jack's Mountain, Stone Mountain, has a lot of lanternflies on top of the ridges. Do you have any ideas why?
Yeah.
We find them there? Are they moving down or something else?
So lanternflies seem to like to be at the highest point locally. So in my first summer here at Penn State, I actually did a study on how lanternflies were basically moving through the forest. And so we took a whole bunch of lanternflies and we marked them with UV fluorescent powder. And then we released them into, I know, we did terrible things. We released them into a forest with transects spread along it, and then went back at night with UV flashlights and saw where they had moved. And the most common place they had moved was uphill, and then they stopped and fed on the first tree that they found. So they like to move upwards, and part of that is probably because, in order to like properly move around, these guys are primarily going to be hopping as the nymphs and then flying as the adults. The higher up they are, the further they can travel that way. So they seem to like high areas, yeah. I saw yours, it's orange.
With the spongy moths, there's been talk about them being somewhat controlled by bacteria and viruses. Is that also big for spotted lanternfly, or is it all about these big predators?
So the question was, with spongy moth, you see them being controlled with like bacteria and viruses. Is that a thing for spotted lanternfly as well? It is. Another project I worked on was looking at a fungal pathogen called Bavaria bassiana, which does infect spotted lanternfly. It's a bit of an insect generalist, but they do like sell this as a biopesticide. So basically you can get the spores in the spray and spray them. And then that does infect spotted lanternfly. It's needs to be somewhat humid for it to survive well, but at least in the lab, it showed pretty good promise. In being quite infective, and it will bring it down, yeah. Yes,
So I've only seen spotted lanternflies on Tree of Heaven. So how did you find them on these other species?
so, while I would say, especially, are you seeing them primarily as adults on the Tree of Heaven?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So the question was, you're
Well,
seeing,
yeah, in one woods we're talking about, and
Yeah.
then something else.
so the question was, we're seeing them primarily on Tree of Heaven. How are they on these other species? The answer is, they tend to prefer the more woody species as they're older, as they're adults, as they're like the later instar nymphs. The little ones actually can't really pierce that far, so if they're in the trees, they're up on the leaves, or they're on the sort of the herbaceous plants around. So if I'm going out to the field and I'm trying to collect like first through like third instars, I'm actually going to be checking like the poke feed, because they'll be usually on that. And if there's no Tree of Heaven in the area, they're going to feed on other host plants. They don't need the Tree of Heaven to complete their life cycle and reproduce. So if there's no Tree of Heaven around, they're still going to feed on other plants. Maples are a big one. Things in Rosaceae, so that's your cherries and fruit trees a lot. They like black walnut. So they are on other things. And then they just have a preference for the Tree of Heaven. So if the Tree of Heaven is in the area, that's probably what they'll go to. Unless there's this weird phenomenon called the hot tree phenomenon, where sometimes there's just one tree and it's not always a Tree of Heaven, where just tons of them will swarm to that one. And there's many people trying to figure out what it is about those trees that attract them. As of yet, we don't know. Just because it seems to even just be like, you can have two trees of the same species, like 5 feet away, and that one's a hot tree and that one's not, and we're trying to figure out why, but sometimes you see that as well.
I'm gonna chime in with a couple Zoom questions here. A couple of these are from Larry. He said, are there no flycatchers or small birds of prey have been reported?
We have had flycatchers, yeah, we get a few small birds of prey as well.
Okay.
Yeah, especially for the nymph stages, like I've known. There was one, I think it was even, I want to say it was on a bird walk, because I actually had several people report into me at once where they had seen a flycatcher on a black walnut, basically just going along, picking up the nymphs along the branch. I had a few different people give me some really nice photos from that, so that was.
Another one here. Can we summarize that the spotted lanternflies sequester the toxins in their wings, since that is what gets torn off?
So they have them in their wings, I will say, from when I actually like quantified the level of toxins, a lot of them were also in the salivary glands and guts. So basically along the digestive tract, And then after that, I was doing females, so it was your cuticle, which is your exoskeleton, and your ovaries. Which makes sense because they're passing them on to the exoskeleton. So yes, they will be storing at least some of them in the wings.
And then one more. Is all that like initial information about the kind of spotted lanternfly damage, has that been warranted, or have you found that the threat has been adjusted at all?
I think that the threat has been adjusted somewhat in that. So like, for example, when they invaded in like Japan and Korea, they were really going after fruit trees. And here, they just don't really seem to be going for the fruit trees. So that certainly has been an adjustment. So we're not as worried about like our apples or whatever. Whereas if you just looked at the data from like Japan, Korea, you'd be like, oh no, our apples are doomed. Whereas they weren't necessarily having as many problems with their grape. But then here, our grape, you know, like the older vines can survive it, but certainly for the younger vines, it will still stress them out enough that they're not going to survive over the winter. I think at least I will say among entomologists, I would say that our reaction has been fairly consistent in our estimations of what the damage was going to be. I do sort of recall there being much more of a media thing when they were first here that maybe was a bit over the top. But among at least like the people who were talking to people in the areas where these were previously invasive and whatever, it's fairly consistent with what we were expecting. Yeah. Yeah.
So what are your observations and predictions about the weather? Because I've seen a lot of the miles in the south, some in the south, but not where I live.
Okay, so the question was, what are the predictions about the movement towards us here in State College? I have some terrible news for you. Yeah, they're definitely here. So for years when I was doing this research and I was pulling my lanternflies to do this research on, when I started, I had to drive out to Berks. Then I was driving out to Lewistown. This year, the spotted lanternflies I was collecting for research, I was collecting on campus. There's a few stands of Tree of Heaven on campus. So now whenever I need my 1,000 lanternflies or whatever, I just go into those and I grab them. So they're here, but they're probably going to be concentrated primarily in areas that are more urban, just because a lot of this transport is human mediated. They're hopping onto our cars. So one of the stands of Tree of Heaven that I get a lot of mine from is right across the street from the stadium. Oh, I wonder where they came from. So yeah, so they're definitely here. You may not see them quite yet if you live in a little bit away from where people are regularly traveling to. And if you have fewer of these Tree of Heaven and other hosts that are like highly preferred by them, you probably won't see them as much. They're definitely here. Yeah.
Let's see, spark two questions. So my first one was wondering, so when you're talking about them removing the wings, you were able to just find out the chemical is just in the wing? Because like so for example, like if I just fed a cockroach or something to a mantis, it's gonna rip the wings off anyway. And so I'm curious like how much of that is them avoiding extra toxins and then that's just their feeding strategy.
Yeah, so certainly some of it is going to be just their feeding strategy. I think because you see this with like a lot of larger prey items, especially like a few years ago, we had the periodical cicadas come out and you were finding periodical cicada wings because, you know, they're not as meaty and tasty. But, you know, in order for like, but certainly naive birds will still sometimes like eat the wings. So there is still a chance that some of this is like, oh, either I learned that this doesn't have as good nutrition, or I learned that this is a way to make me feel less sick. So there's probably still a learning component, especially if you're already treating other prey this way. It makes you easier to pick up and do this behavior more as well. Yeah, so tying it exactly to that is like not actually an easy thing to do because you can't go up to the bird and interview them and be like, hello, Mr. Bird. Are you tearing off the wings because you don't think that it's worth the effort to eat them or because they taste bad? So we can, but we know that there's claustinoids in the wings. We know that the birds are eating the wings. So we know that they are going to get less of a claustinoid load by not having those wings on there.
And then the second, when you mentioned pokeweed,
Yeah,
that's toxic as well, right? So if the nymphs are eating that, is that a different toxin or are they?
as far as I can tell, no. Like, so the toxins, at least that I was finding that were highly abundant are claustinoids, which are specifically produced by plants in the family that Tree of Heaven is in. And here in the US, we only actually have one. In the US as a whole, one native species in that family, and it's more of a tropical Florida thing. So like the only plant in that family they're going to run across here is Tree of Heaven. So as long as it is just those claustinoids, they're probably not going to be effective at taking up things from other toxic plants like pokeweed, like our black walnut, which you were definitely seeing. This is why I wish that we had the results back from the indole alkaloids, because those are a bit more common. But those ones are less like tied to spotted lanternfly necessarily, so hopefully no. Yeah. Maybe I was wrong. Sorry, maybe I answered your question. Yeah.
Are there any plants you found that like have any other types of effects on like the spotted lanternfly?
Yes, so this question was asked because I was treated to a very lovely dinner, and what I'm actually working on now is as part of that citizen science project, I had a lot of people emailing asking in, hey, I've heard that feeding on milkweed will actually kill the spotted lanternflies. Is this true? And Penn State Extension had like sort of addressed this in a little like busting spotted lanternfly myths article, except the addressing was basically saying we have no scientific evidence either way. So me and my friend, my friend was working on monarch butterflies, which famously you need milkweed to raise. And I'm like, hey, can I throw some milkweed? I just want to like confirm and then we'll be good. What I confirmed after 24 hours and coming back to check and see was that 80% of my spotted lanternflies that were on my milkweed were dead, and 100% of the ones that I had put on grape as my control were still alive. So what I'm working on now is basically confirming, trying to identify why they are dying after feeding on milkweed. And also what actually I did get results back from and is quite hopeful to me at least is that I put them in a cage with both a grape plant and a milkweed plant. Would they still feed on the milkweed in the presence of the grape? And the answer is yes, they'll still feed on it and they'll still die. So yeah, it seems like milkweed might also just sort of, if they happen to feed on it, end up in them dying. So that's fun.
Is there a chance to take some of the milkweed toxin and leave those as
So potentially, yes. A lot of our pesticides, so the question was, is there a chance to like take the toxin from the milkweed and basically just use it as a pesticide? A lot of your pesticides are exactly that. So if you think of like your most common pesticides that people apply, here in the US, it's pyrethroids, which is based on pyrethrum, which comes from chrysanthemums, and it's neonicotinoids, which is based on nicotine, which comes from tobacco. So nearly all of our pesticides we use are just plant defenses that we are basically spraying onto our plants.
We're going to potentially go that route.
Yeah, so the 1 with that would be that that's definitely like would need the involvement of a pesticide company, because in order to like actually make a pesticide. You do need to like go through like EPA approval, and you need to do all these tests and prove that you're not like having wild off-target effects. If you're applying it properly, at least, and stuff like that. So that would certainly be years down the line. But in theory, in the future, yeah, they probably could. Yes.
And, so you're wrapping up, your study's done, people that have interactions they wanna send you, you're not taking this anyone now? Still, or are you going to
So-
continue?
I have in my heart that I want to continue. I'm looking at my workload and realizing it's unrealistic. But I did just go to a conference just last week, specifically on spotted lanternfly, and I was actually discussing with two different groups who were mostly like undergrad serving institutions about having potentially people there pick up the project and then them running it. So potentially, but I'm still in talks with who could actually take over. So if we might still have that in the future. In the meantime, it's still like the Facebook page is still a great place to go and like interact with people who are still sending stuff out. So, yeah.
Just have a clarification, okay, so you're showing your diagrams, you made the point that birds would eat the lanternfly if they were, if the lanternflies were feeding off of like a black, black walnut, right? Okay, so that means the birds would have to observe the actual spotted lanternfly eating the black walnut, correct? Or eating off that, because if the bird, I'm just trying to get the psychology here, because if the bird does not eat the spotted lanternfly, if it's feeding off the tree of heaven, then it is eating it if it's feeding off of the black walnut. How does the bird know that?
So I suspect this is still due to the birds being what we call naive, where they haven't interacted with spotted lanternfly before. So they're willing to try. There's like multiple studies that a bird is willing to try a new source of prey at least a few times. Like in my nest box one, where they were willing to like take like 2 or 3 of the lanternflies before finally being like, yeah, okay, fine. Or like in my suet, where they were pecking it like 2 or 3 times before being like in. Whereas like they were pecking, the non-tree of heaven suet like 5 or 6 times. So they would like go until they were full or something scared them away or whatever. Whereas before they would like maybe give up after a little while. So I think a lot of this is more trial and error than necessarily, oh, I saw it eat that, and I can think in my head, that one will be fine. But also potentially like you may get cases where birds will like, be in an area where you don't have a lot of tree of heaven, and those birds will think they're fine because they're not sequestering defenses. Whereas if you get birds where there's tons of tree of heaven, they might be more reluctant to feed on.
So you believe they are able to distinguish the area which they're picking. I just can't.
Not necessarily,
Yeah.
just like whatever area happens to be their hunting ground. I imagine that if your hunting ground contains spotted lanternflies that taste good, you'll keep eating spotted lanternflies. Some birds might be able to tell. I'm not a bird expert. I feel like you would know, maybe no, okay. But like, certainly like, like I said, one of our groups that we had feeding on them a lot were like corvids. I know corvids are smart and do a bit more pattern recognition. It might be willing to be like, oh yeah, this one tastes good. But yeah, it's hard to say that because birds are, all birds. Yeah. So yeah.
So how do you know when you're making the soot with spotted lanternfly that you're not gonna harm the birds? Are they really?
So there's a few ways that we know this. First of all, again, I quantified the amount of quasinoids. So I do know how much is in there, and I know at least some of the tested LD50s for those compounds, and it's not high enough to kill them unless they were eating like pounds and pounds. Second of all, most insects and other organisms that are using sort of toxic defenses don't want to kill the predator anyways. Because a predator that dies hasn't learned anything. So like that aposematic coloration only works because it ate one, felt a little bit ill, but was fine and still learned that lesson and can, depending on the species, maybe teach their chicks to avoid and whatever. But if you just like straight out kill that predator, it doesn't really work. And there are examples of even like wasps where you can track the evolution over time where their venom has actually gotten like less deadly because just killing is not beneficial to the species, because then it's just going to be another predator is going to come. It's not actually going to deter. Yeah.
All right, thank you again, Anne. And yeah, if you have questions, there's Anne's contact information there.